This is an interview with Mrs. Polly Tracy by Sheila Sweeney on July 15, 1980. The topic of the interview is Carolyn Foster, and the location of the interview is Mrs. Tracy's home on Cadena Road in Morristown. Mrs. Tracy, can you tell me a little bit about how you came to Morristown and then how you met Miss Foster?
We were living in Short Hills, and my husband wanted more room around him and a country feeling, and fell in love with this house, and that's how we came here. And he looked for some years before he finally found it. And Miss Foster, I believe the first time that we met her was after she had telephoned or had someone telephone and asked if we'd like to buy eggs. No, eggs or butter, I don't know, something that she raised on the farm. And so we went over and we met, and then I met her later at the tea party in the valley, and we were invited back, and we took her to a party which was given by the people that had lived in this house before we came here. You stopped me when you... And then my children were enchanted with her. She was so different. You've seen pictures of her, or maybe you knew her at all. Did you know her?
No, I didn't.
She dressed in very mannish clothes, but always a woman's skirt, and mannish type shoes, low flat heels, and man's Brooks Brothers shirt with a little bow tie, and very well tailored jacket, but a skirt always. In the evening when she went out, she was superb. She wore a sort of a smoking jacket, like a tuxedo jacket, black, and a silk shirt, and a nice tuxedo tie, and a black broadcloth skirt. And she made all the other women look like Christmas trees, overdressed, you know.
Yeah.
But she wore men's hats, and in her front hall, I was very impressed when I first went. She had antlers hanging up on the wall, and on each point was a different kind of a hat, a fedora or a Panama or a sort of a farmer's cap with a broad visor, and really a wardrobe of men's type of hats, all of which she wore at one time or another. Mm-hmm. And that we knew her from then on, and that was 28 years that we came in 1952. Mm-hmm. And as we became better acquainted with Miss Foster, I used to drive her to various meetings of garden club and various things which she attended, because she didn't drive, but she did drive. Her tractor in the field, they point her in a straight line, and she would pull the tractor ahead, and behind her would be the binder for the hay or whatever it was, and the farmer would work with that. But she had been a great driver of cars, and I do have a nice story about her first car. Her father would not permit her to have a car. She was an only child. She'd had two brothers who died in their very young childhood. And she was raised, her mother died also, I think when she was a baby, really, just a tiny child, when either before or after they first moved out here. And she lived there on the farm with her father and several aunts and uncles, all of whom looked after her, but I think she was very lonely. And there's a nice story that one uncle found she was afraid to go upstairs in the dark and go to bed in her little child's bed in one of the front rooms one of the rooms upstairs. And he said, "I will fix this." And so he went upstairs and got a large pair of his boots and set them by her bed. And he said, she had a child's bed. She said, "Now you'll never be afraid, because any burglar coming in would see these big boots and would know that a big man slept in his bed." And you'd never be afraid again. And she said, "I wasn't, you know." But she had lots of stories about her childhood. She used to fish with her father. She used to smoke a cigar to keep midges off, she told me, while she was fishing. You know, it would be very helpful. And she didn't smoke that I ever knew of, but maybe she did when she was younger. But she fished and hunted, and she ran the farm, of course. When we first came here, she was still farming it, and Earl Beach, who you've talked to, was her farmer at the time that we came, but she'd had others before that. And she had very few cows, I think, left by then. But they were a herd of Jerseys, her father had gone to the island of Jersey to select a new governor. Well, I think it was very interesting. And he drove them out from Hoboken. I mean, he was drovers, you know, and came out. And I think maybe she went to meet the drovers coming out from Hoboken. And that must have been a long time ago. And these were descendants of that original herd that she had here when we first came in the pasture where Foster Fields now is. She used that pasture right there. And she was very fond of dogs, and she had a large assortment at one point. One of her dogs had puppies, and I think there were 6 or 8 puppies, and there are all these little cute little black things wandering around. And the father of these puppies lived next door on the other side of us. We're next door to Miss Foster. Our properties are contiguous for a parkway, not just a short distance, to the south of us and to the north of her. And beyond us to the north lived a family who had a dog who fathered the large family of puppies. And she just loved them all very dearly and kept them. And I think most of them were females. And we suggested that it might be a good idea if she had them spayed, but she didn't ever. No, she didn't want. She wanted to have all puppies. And I think there were several families of puppies. I'm afraid it later the story to the public. My daughter found her, all of the girls found her just fascinating. They liked to go over and she'd tell stories of the old days and of her family and of her predecessor in that house who was, I read her the story that he had wrote of his life. Not the whole of it, but I read excerpts from it to her, and it was the story of General Revere. I'm sure you have the story of his building the house and his having been in the Navy first before he was in the Army, and traveled in I guess he fought the Berber pirates or someone in the Mediterranean and went all through Spain. And there's a very good book that he wrote about it. Miss Foster was very interested in that. I think she had read it before, but she wanted it reviewed. We read her all kinds of things. She loved animal stories, and she was particularly interested in the story of The Wolves by Farley Mowat. I don't remember the name of it now, but I read her that book. And as I say, my girls were interested in her because she knew she knew so much about local politics. She had been in local politics, and she knew about farming, and she read an enormous amount of, and remembered practically everything she ever read, I'm sure. And she could, if you quoted something, she could always finish it off for you. That was amazing too, because she hadn't been able to read for some time at the time I was speaking. And about 15, 20 years ago, one of my daughters was working for an international group of students, graduate students of economics and sociology who would come to this country and have internships in industry here. And we sent students to their countries, and they had a headquarters in New York. It was called ISEC. And Susie said people don't get a chance to meet people out here, and I would like to have them here for some of them here for dinner. The ones from the New York area. Susie met them, put them through trains, planes, and found places for them to live if they were in the New York area, and sent them on their way, and helped them get home too. But I said I should be happy to have any number that she wanted, and she said that. I said, but I'd like to know how many. And she said, well, I think 35. And I said, well, but I would have 35 for dinner on Sunday, and we do what we could, and particularly as they came from all over and were of all different religious faiths. And I did some inquiries into what food could be served without offending. And they were from India, Africa, Europe, and South America, everywhere. 65 turned up. Apparently they brought their friends. She thought only 35 were in the whole area, but they brought their friends. And we did very well, and we did not run out of anything except ice, gin, these were adults, and potatoes, I guess scalloped potatoes. But the food held out. And Miss Foster was a star performer. She arrived in her white linen suit with her bow tie and her white Panama hat, man's hat. And she never removed it during luncheon. And Susie wanted her friends to meet someone who could tell them about farming here and local sort of things. And she was always so well informed. So Miss Foster told the story on herself afterwards. She said, as you know, I don't see well, and said I was standing next to a tall figure. I could see the outline and the dark face and a long white dress. And I wanted to make conversation, so I said, is it Miss or Mrs.? I didn't get the name. And she said, I was surprised when a deep voice answered, it is neither. I am Gideon Gadabiku from Liberia. It was a man. And she chuckled. She was so cute. She pulled at her tie and chuckled and gave a wicked giggle. And she said, he probably thought I was a man. It didn't matter. She pulled at her tie, you know. But that always tickled me, her idea of meeting. But she did. She talked with everybody, and she was interesting to them all. They enjoyed it thoroughly. They persisted in calling this place a park, which upset my daughter very much. It's ours! It isn't a park! She just wanted. Oh, I forgot I was on the tape. Oh dear.
What kinds of things did Miss Foster talk about?
Everything. She talked about all sorts of things. And she was very opinionated, extremely opinionated. I'm going to say this because it's true, and she would admit it. She never backed down on any opinions, and my dear mother-in-law was 2 days apart from her, I think, in age. No, she was maybe a couple of years younger, but their birthdays were 2 days apart. And we had them together quite often for tea, but I found it very difficult because Miss Foster couldn't understand my mother-in-law, who was Southern, and she didn't hear too well, and Miss Foster didn't hear too well. My mother-in-law was totally deaf and read lips and heard that way, and Miss Foster generally spoke with her hand over her mouth, which made it very difficult for Mrs. Tracy. But they loved each other. They admired each other. They both were very gallant souls, and they faced their difficulties in their old age with great courage. And after Miss Foster, I tried to have another person here who could talk to one while I talked to the other, so that it was so hard for them to communicate. But they still admired each other, and they liked to see each other. And after Miss Foster left one time, my mother-in-law said, she's such a sweet woman. And I said, no, Granny dear, she is not sweet. She's very salty, which is what she was. And it was such fun. It was refreshing. Much more fun than just sweetness, you know. That's why I enjoyed her so. She always said, I wish I could think of some of her sassy remarks. I can't. I'm sorry. Can't quote any. All right, you want to turn it off? I don't think I've told the whole story of Miss Foster having an automobile. Her father wouldn't permit her to have one, and she wanted one very much, and she must have been in her 40s or older, because this house was built in 1918, and the lady who built it and other friends of Miss Foster's, and she only lived here about 6 years at most, probably. It must have been in the early 20s. Her friends, including Mrs. Rawl, who lived here, got together and bought her a car. And they were going to give it to either for birthday or Christmas, I don't know which, but it was here in the stable of this house. It was kept until the day, and then a ribbon was tied around it, and the Rawl chauffeur drove it over to Miss Foster's on the appointed day and made a presentation. I mean, it was given to her. And she drove, from then on, she was a liberated spirit. She drove everywhere. She drove up to Hartford, where her family had originated, and she still had relatives. She drove everywhere, and she just loved it. And that was the story of her car. And then from then on, she had cars, and she couldn't really drive, but she used to get in, and she said that she could get up her driveway from the farm to her house in a car. And we said, how do you keep on the road? Well, she said, you could hear the road, and if you run off, I just go slowly. If I run off a little, I hear it, and I can tell when I'm halfway there, because the archway of stones over the driveway makes an echo. When I hear that, then I know I'm there, and pretty soon I have to make a turn to the right. But she did manage. I don't think I would want to be in the driveway and meet her coming. It'd be rather terrifying. But she was spunky, and she'd do anything. She also told stories about building that little house down the playhouse on her property, which she did a good deal of herself, but she'd had a mason, I believe, build a chimney. And Mrs. Steinmetz, who lived next door here, is now gone from here, but she and I used to go for picnic lunches over there. She'd provide coffee or something, and we'd provide sandwiches, and we'd have lunch in the little playhouse, which she apparently had really built herself, except for the masonry. And it was a cute little house, and I guess she used it for herself. It's a very small house over on the far driveway. And Mrs. Steinmetz was wonderful. She used to read to her a great deal, and every time after she moved away from here, when they came through from Florida on their way to New Hampshire or Vermont, wherever they lived, she'd stop off to see Miss Foster and give her great pleasure. On one occasion, my husband was then working for S.O. Standard Oil, now Exxon, and they were having a stockholders meeting over in Bayway, and Mrs. Davidson, who lived in the valley, his husband had worked for S.O. also, and I were going, and we asked Miss Foster if she'd like to go. She had shares of stock there. Indeed, she would, and we knew that she had been sometimes come to, I think, bank board meetings in Morristown and had asked very pointed questions. And so my husband, who was an officer in the company, told the president that we might have some very sharp questionings from Miss Foster, because she was a shrewd lady, and she also wanted to know what was going on. And we got there, and it was in a great big boiler house with little, very stiff folding chairs of wood. And the meeting went on, and the man that used to ask all the embarrassing questions asked them, and the lady who did the same. And they kept the meeting going. It was fairly lively, but Miss Foster never said a word. And I got worried about her, and I said, Cara, you've been so quiet. Are you all right? And she wiggled in the chair and sort of made it clap a little, and she sat up and down, and she said, yes, but my tail is permanently bent. And then afterward, we took her over to meet the president, and she had her picture taken with him in front of the new, I think it was at the time when some kind of gasoline was new, and they were showing a new kind of pump. And, and on the front of the house organ of the Esso Standard Oil Company, the newspaper, there was a lovely picture of Miss Foster and the president of Esso standing in front of this Esso pump. And she was a real cover girl at that point. I thought, okay. When I first knew Miss Foster, she had a wonderful maid named Maylie, who was Swiss, and she was a wonderful woman. The two of them used to argue together, but they got on beautifully, and I think there was great mutual respect. And Maylie also ordered her around a little bit, and apparently when she came to the wedding of one of my daughters, Maylie told her she should not wear the man's hat that she intended to wear, and probably the Panama since it was in summer, and insisted that she wear a lady's hat. And she arrived here with a very impressive hat with something sticking up in the front. It was I think what you call a toque, but it was not a modern hat by any means. Perhaps it had belonged to her mother, or certainly dated from many years before, but it was definitely a lady's hat. That was all I remember about that occasion. One time when I was away, we were away in the wintertime in Florida, and our maid was here, Minnie, who was with us for many, many years, and she loved our dog, and our dog, we've always had collies. The dog disappeared, and he didn't usually go off anywhere, but he got away, and Minnie was very upset. And she didn't know what to do, and she called Miss Foster to ask her what she should do about the lost dog. And Miss Foster and Earl Beach got on the phone, and they called all the police departments all around, and they finally located him over near Scotch Plains someplace, and they went over and picked him up and brought him home. And I think that was very kind. And Minnie went with them, and they all drove over and picked up our dog, and we were so touched that she would go to all that trouble for a neighbor's dog.
Yeah, that was nice.
Yes, turn that on.